So I don't mean to scare people when I say that Kant is a very, very difficult read. Maybe I do. I want to scare you enough to make sure that when you sit down to read the readings that are coming up, the readings that we're going to have are going to be from the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic. Those are going to be assigned readings. I believe I've also I'll double check this, and anybody can feel free to double check me on this right now. I believe with that reading assignment, I've also posted some selections from the Critique of Pure Reason. I'll talk about the relationship between those texts in a little bit. So what was I? Oh, yeah. I don't want to scare you. That's not true. I do. I want to scare you a little bit so that you don't do something silly like, I don't know, try to read the assigned readings in the hour before class and, do the reading quiz and show up to class and be like, everything's going to be fine. It's going to take longer than that. Set aside some serious time to read and reread. And I'm happy to begin with a little bit of a prelude about, what I think the value of assigning a very, very difficult text like this is. But Shai's got a question first.
Part of exam 1
This is going to be part of exam 1, which hasn't been posted yet. Yeah, it's not the new unit. We're still going to be, as you might be able to tell by the title, Prolegomena, Any Future Metaphysic, we're still in the metaphysics and epistemology portion of the course. There will be a really clear break when we start the second half, and it'll be after spring break. And it's going to be very, very clearly about politics. And we're also going to, you've noticed we've been kind of inching forward in time, starting back with Descartes, whose meditations were 1640, and now we're up to 1783 for the Prolegomena, 1787 for the B version of the Critique of Pure Reason. So yeah, we're moving forward in time. And then when we start the political unit, we're going to go all the way back again. We're going to start again with Hobbes and then move forward there. So that thing that I said before about, I don't mean to scare you, I just mean to, prepare you. All of that said, this is probably going to, here it is, the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic. This is probably going to be the hardest thing that you're going to read as a student, which is going to put it pretty high in the running for the hardest thing that you're ever going to read for your entire life. The good news is, once you read it and you understand it, you'll have conquered a big, nasty thing. You can read almost anything else, right? If you can read Kant, you can read almost anything else. So again, yeah, this kind of demands an answer to the question then, why read something so difficult? And the really kind of low-hanging fruit answer, maybe the easy, maybe too easy answer is, because it's really good. Some people might disagree with this. I've had plenty of friends, including philosopher friends, and plenty of students say they think that Kant is just a bad writer. I'm not sure if that's true. I don't know if he is actually a bad writer. He has a very idiosyncratic writing style. It's very different than the way that many people usually talk. But then again, he's asking us to think in a way that's very different than many people think. I think there might be something about the style of thinking that he's employing that requires a sort of a difficult text. And in fact, there have been places where Kant comes right out and says that he intentionally made this text difficult. And he made it difficult for, kind of maybe paradoxically, for a lot of the same reasons that David Hume critiques the abstract style of philosophy that he says is written in this kind of inscrutable way. Kant says he made it very, very difficult to understand because when you make something easy to understand, people read it and they're like, oh, I get it. And Kant didn't want that. He wanted people to only think that they understood this after they had put in the time to really try to understand it. It's a challenge to understand Kant. And that's good. This starts to get into other reasons why I assign him. It's a challenge to read Kant, and that means that you're all the more likely to end up in a kind of a dialectical relationship with this text. If your experience with Immanuel Kant is anything like my experience has been with Immanuel Kant, it's going to look something like this. You'll go through waves of kind of saying, I have no idea what the hell this guy is talking about. And then you'll keep reading and keep thinking about it, and you'll be like, oh, I think I see what he's talking about. I think I get it, but he's totally wrong. Then you'll be like, oh, wait, no, now I get what he's talking about. Oh, shit, he's right. And then it'll all fall, as you learn more about it and you read more, it'll all fall apart again. You'll be like, nope, I don't get what he's talking about. And then you'll start the cycle anew. This is the sort of thing that actually gets you to find new things every time you come back to the text. It keeps the text alive. There have been other philosophers, Plato, I think, is notably one of these, who writes in this dialogical style that keeps you coming back to the text and finding new things every single time. And part of that is that part of what makes that work in Platonic dialogues is when it's not really clear what it is that Plato is trying to say. This is probably like the most true in the aporetic dialogues, these dialogues where it looks like no solution is found to the problem. They're just trying to work through it. And as you read through over and over and over again, you see that hidden in the dialogue are like possible solutions to the problem. And you're kind of invited as a reader to flesh them out and be like, all right, so what if the interlocutor had said this instead of this? And it brings you into a relationship with the text that's a real give and take. I have an idea. I look back to the text to be like, is that right? The text says like, no, not quite. And I'm like, okay, I have to like adjust the idea. Is the adjusted idea right? Bring it back to the text. Yeah, better. And like, okay, I'm understanding it better. You're going to go through successive confusions, but they're going to become better and better confusions each time you run through it. And this is kind of maybe a necessary aspect to reading and trying to understand Kant. I think it's also maybe something that Kant builds into his writing style. We'll notice, and I'll comment on this again as we kind of go through, but not just in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic, but like all of his post-critical works, all of like Kant's philosophy after 1781, which if you're looking at his birthday, he was born in 1724. The Critique of Pure Reason the first version was published in 1781. He's kind of old when he writes this, and this is the beginning of his career as a philosopher. Like he was a philosopher before, and he was like teaching philosophy before. But his pre-critical works, everything before 1781, is not really very widely read and not taken very seriously. We usually think of Kant as beginning his project in, relatively later years of his life. This gives great hope to like young 38-year-old philosophers who are like, I haven't had my big book yet. And it's like, that's all right, Kant hadn't either. And like, look at him, he was awesome. Yeah, Corbin. Yeah. No. Yeah, I'll try. And then with a big asterisk that says, Kant is going to ask us to radically change the way that we think of what metaphysics is. But metaphysics is, perhaps we can think of it as, it's this thing that David Hume seems relatively sour on. We didn't really get to this. I got to talk in our last meeting about how, with this problem of induction, it's not just cause and effect that goes, but a lot of things seem to like fly out the window along with cause and effect in Hume's inquiry, especially in section 4. Substance is one of these ideas of kind of like secret powers, like the thingliness of things, some sort of like invisible power that like brings all of the impressions together and makes them inhere in the same underlying substance. That's what substance means. It substands. It stands underneath something and holds all of the qualities that like we have impressions of, and we're like, okay, these all belong to the same thing. Hume is saying like, you can't really quite do that, or at least there's no rational grounding for it. You can do it. You do it all the time. All of our minds make these necessary connections between cause and effect. It's just that it's not warranted. It's not grounded in any sort of rational justification. It's just something that our minds happen to do. We have no right to kind of like assume any sort of reliability about it, or maybe more importantly, any truth about it. And this maybe gets to what metaphysics is all about. Physics explores the natural world. And the way that we tend to explore the natural world, the way that Hume says we explore the natural world, the way that we learn about matters of fact, is we go out and we have empirical experience about it. And then we see, like, what can we generalize from that experience? This is how natural science works. Metaphysics, on the other hand, tries to go beyond the appearances. It's not just how things seem to us. It's not just how things appear to our empirical senses and our empirical faculties. It's about the reality behind that. So questions about things that you have no sense impressions of, like, for example, God, the nature of God, the existence of God. You have no sense impressions of these things. This seems to be a metaphysical problem. These questions about like the nature of God and the existence of God is a metaphysical problem. Some folks might say it's a supernatural problem. Yeah, maybe. My mind is not supernatural, though, and it seems like I have no empirical experiences of my mind, of like my thinking self. And so the way I arrive at it is through some other sort of faculty. This is a metaphysical problem. What's the nature of the self is a metaphysical problem. What is the substance that all of the things in the world are made of? How many substances are there? Are there two? Is there mind and matter? Is everything really made of matter? These are also metaphysical problems. These are the problems that lie underneath in our natural scientific investigations. Literally, the word metaphysics comes from Aristotle's Metaphysics, which only means like it's the book that comes after physics. There's like the physics, which explores like nature. Physis means nature, roughly in Greek. And then there are all of the things that like pop up, all of the new questions that happen after you've studied physics. Some might say they would have to be addressed before you study physics. It's first philosophy sometimes. Descartes refers to his meditations on first philosophy. A lot of folks who are into metaphysics will think of metaphysics as first philosophy. These are the fundamental problems that like you have to solve these before you can perhaps ground empirical science. So am I kind of talking around it enough to give you a sense of what metaphysics is? Hume also seemed to be describing metaphysics when he was talking about the abstract style of philosophy, not the practical style of philosophy that appeals to sentiment and habit and things like that. No. It's that abstract kind of philosophy that's very difficult to follow, and it seems to not have any necessarily like practical applications to it. If it does, it's kind of like organizing the way we think about things. This is like metaphysics is valuable for doing practical philosophy in the same way Hume says that studying anatomy is useful for painting bodies. It's not the sort of thing that's absolutely necessary, but it gets at the underlying reality behind the appearances, right? And that perhaps is useful. But Hume is sour on this, and it's not like he sets out to kind of attack metaphysics. It's by virtue of the arguments that he makes. It's by virtue, seemingly, he starts from a relatively common sense empiricism. He's giving a description of how our minds work that looked pretty plausible, looked really similar to John Locke's picture of how our minds work in sections 1, 2, and 3 of Hume's Enquiry. And it looked relatively similar, I think, to most of our impressions about how our minds work, even today. But in sections 4 and 5, those relatively kind of innocuous beginnings, that starting from a kind of a common sense empiricism, leads us to this sort of relatively radical skepticism. In some ways, we can think of Hume's project as kind of affecting the opposite movement that Descartes did. Descartes starts with a methodological skepticism, and he's trying to get to a reconstruction of the world, right? We start by suspending all of our beliefs with that methodological radical doubt in Meditation 1. And then as the meditations go on, he's trying to kind of build the world back up such that at the end of it, in Meditation 6, he's hopefully as close as he could get in 6 meditations to giving a portrayal of the world that's more or less the way that we see and understand it, or the way that like it makes sense to us in everyday human sorts of activities. Does he actually pull the whole project off? That's something you wrote about. That's like a debate to be had. But this project from Hume is like exactly the opposite. And you didn't have this in your reading because it's in section 12 of the Enquiry, and we only read sections 1 through 5. But towards the end of the Enquiry concerning human understanding, David Hume says this, and it's a relatively famous quote from Hume, and maybe gives you some sense of what he thinks of metaphysics. He says, when we go through the libraries convinced of these principles, and we can think of that's all the principles that like he establishes earlier on in the Enquiry. This includes this problem of induction, which is kind of the center of gravity for why it is that Hume is interesting in the first place. When we go through the libraries convinced of these principles, what havoc must we make? If we take in our hand any volume of divinity, or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning about quantity or numbers? Abstract reasoning about quantity or numbers. This is the relation between ideas, right? He's talking about mathematics there. He could maybe just as well be talking about logic as well. Does it contain any reasoning about quantity and number? No. Does it contain any experiential reasoning about matters of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. This is how sour David Hume is on metaphysics. He wants to burn all the metaphysics. Maybe he's being like a little bit jokey there, but that's a bold claim to make. It's not just like, metaphysics, it's not for me. Or like remember earlier on in section 1, which isn't there, but that's where I wrote it a couple of days ago. In section 1 of the Enquiry, Hume was like, well, it seems like metaphysics is relatively harmless. And now he seems to be saying like, no, like get rid of it. It's just nonsense. It can contain only sophistry and illusion. This is this kind of trying to go beyond your impressions, which he says, like, you have some sort of, like, expectation that patterns that you've observed in the past are going to persist into the future. And this makes your mind make a jump to a necessary cause and effect relationship that gives you some sort of sense of like, what is the reality really like there behind all the appearances? And David Hume says, like, you can't make that jump. And this is why metaphysics is bunk. Or at least it's not or like any matters, like all the stuff about matters of fact isn't grounded in any sort of rational warrant. It's just kind of playing out the habits of how our minds work. It's appealing to custom and habit. So this is David Hume. We're relatively familiar with David Hume and what a mess he makes of epistemology and metaphysics. Immanuel Kant reads this mess and he's like, oh boy, this is awesome. Not because he agrees with it. In fact, he disagrees with it. Immanuel Kant is actually trying to offer a response to David Hume. He refers to David Hume as having, whoa, is that what I need? No. He refers to David Hume as having awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. And we might think to ourselves, like, what took Kant so long to get started as, like, a philosopher? Well, I might ask, well, what took you so long to get started as a philosopher? Well, like, why does Kant only really get going in 1781 when he was born all the way in 1724? This is not like some other modern philosophers who get started on things right away. And the answer seems to be he hadn't read Hume yet. And when he did read Hume, suddenly it was just like, okay, we got to start from scratch. So we can think of this Kantian project in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics and in the Critique of Pure Reason as, first and foremost, offering a genuine response to Hume. And what I mean by a genuine response there is it's not a dismissal. It's not like, Hume, you're like, or it's not even like this critical approach where you're kind of like, Hume, you've made this mistake and this mistake and this mistake in your argument, so we can ignore all of your arguments. It's not brushing Hume aside. It's actually embracing an awful lot of what Hume says. It takes Hume more or less at his word that like the problem that he's raised is a serious problem that needs to be engaged and can't just be ignored or shrugged off. And so the response that Kant is going to have to offer is going to be one that works within the problems that Hume has laid out in his inquiry. I mentioned we got, Critique of Pure Reason in 1781, and then we've got an A and a B version, just to give you some sense of how meticulous Kant was. And he was meticulous. If you read stories about the kind of guy he was, maybe it makes his writing style and his thinking style a little less surprising. He was a weird sort of a guy. We read that, or maybe I mentioned, that David Hume first wrote a treatise of human nature, and then that was so poorly received that he rewrote it again in a simpler, more accessible way in the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. Immanuel Kant writes the first draft of this first step in his critical project as the Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. In 1787, he rewrites the whole thing. Like, he doesn't say, here's a new book that, explores the ideas. He rewrites the whole thing. There's an A version and a B version of the Critique of Pure Reason. If you buy a decent copy of the Critique of Pure Reason, it's got both the A version and the B version in it. Some of the passages are identical for A and B, and so it's just one passage, and it kind of, lists the page numbers for the A's and the B's versions kind of side by side as it's going through. Some whole sections are brand new. Some things he makes little edits, and folks who are serious scholars of Kant will pour through all of the little differences between the A version and the B version to try to figure out what was Kant thinking and how was that thinking changing between 1781 and 1787. In 1783, he writes the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic, which is kind of like this thing that Hume did, which is to give a shorter, more accessible version of his big project. So here's the first critique, the Critique of Pure Reason. Here's the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic. You can see it's much, much thinner. Only whereas when Hume did this, it made his reading more accessible, I think it maybe makes the problem sometimes worse for Kant. Because there are incredible details going on in this, and it's almost like he's just rushing through those details in this. That's not to say that if you go back and kind of read through the critique, all of a sudden all of this is going to make sense. Those details can be even more confusing and get you more lost in the weeds. But he writes the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic intending to be a really kind of a shorthand version of the project that's going on in the first critique, in the Critique of Pure Reason. And the intended audience, Kant says, are teachers, any teachers, not philosophy teachers, not philosophers, just anybody who's a teacher of any sort. And the reasoning behind this is because he thinks he's kind of he thinks that humanity has reached this precipice, that David Hume has brought us to this, such that we have to radically reshuffle the way that we think in order to be thinking clearly at all. And everybody needs to be a party to this. This starts to get into some of the things that he's trying to accomplish really explicitly in the Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysic, but are maybe just kind of bouncing around in the background in the Critique of Pure Reason. And that's that Kant is trying to answer this question of, this question of how could metaphysics be possible? Hume says it's not possible. And Kant wants to say, he raises a really big problem. I think after Hume, we can't take for granted that metaphysics even is possible. And when I say, people have been doing Aristotle had a whole book on metaphysics. People have been doing metaphysics ever since they started doing philosophy. And Hume says, yes, but it was just nonsense. Commit it to the flames, right? It can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. And Kant is saying, I'm not so sure about this, or at least maybe we shouldn't let that pass by too easily. We want to ask this question of, if metaphysics were possible, what would that be like? Or how might we have to, as I was saying to Corbin's question, how might we have to what metaphysics is to think of a way in which it could possibly be possible? And it's not just metaphysics, by the way. It's also natural science, because after Hume blowing everything up, natural science still seems possible, but it's just this little habit of your mind that doesn't necessarily correspond to anything in the real world. So it's an ungrounded kind of natural science. And Kant, explicitly in the Prolegomena, perhaps implicitly in the First Critique, is saying it's not just how metaphysics is possible, but we're talking about some sort of grounding of natural science as well. So we're going to talk about the possibility of natural science such that it's rationally grounded. And this is the sort of thing that Hume was it's not. And Kant's but Newton was seems to be making scientific progress. Is Newton talking about reality? Is any of this unbridled success that science is enjoying in the 1700s, is it grounded? Is it rooted in anything? Is it some sort of does it give us some sort of understanding of what the world is actually like? So this question of whether or not natural science is possible is also on the table for Kant. And he also wants to know whether or not, and in what ways, how is mathematics, in particular pure mathematics, how is mathematics possible? And we might think to ourselves, I thought Hume answered that. He said that it's just relations between ideas, that it's that kind of analytic a priori style of thinking, that it's things that are just true by definition. And one of the things that we'll learn about Kant is that he takes a very surprising and bold position on mathematics, which is to say it's not analytic. It might be a priori, but it's not analytic. And he actually, I think a lot of philosophers of mathematics even today look at Kant's position on this and they're just kind of what? You said what now? Mathematics is not analytic? It's not the way that David Hume describes it? It's not just the arrangement of symbols? And Kant's no, it's way more interesting than that. So he's going to give us a version of mathematics, or pure mathematics at least, that's very, very different than anything that we've seen before. He's going to give us a way to ground the natural sciences. He's going to try to give us a way that makes metaphysics possible. I'll just kind of spoiler alert, we'll jump to the end. Kant thinks that he pulls this off. And insofar as I understand what Kant is up to, and I'm not 100% sure about that, and neither should you be, I think he pulls it off. Or he makes it a damn good argument, at least. Which brings us again maybe to this question of so why read Kant if he's so difficult? Well, one of the possible answers to this is that Kant is one of these rare figures in the history of philosophy where we can see everybody before Kant maybe pointing towards this one moment, bringing about this crisis that Hume puts to words and kind of makes clear for everybody. And so Kant, and there are just a few people like this, maybe Plato, maybe Aristotle, not too many other names come readily to mind where we can say they're just unavoidable in the story of the history of philosophy. Everything before them points towards them, and everything after them emanates from them. It's just kind of this. There are these minds and these thought processes that the whole story, no matter how you decide to tell that story, if you want to include these authors and get rid of these authors, or you kind of a lot of these folks can be shuffled around. There are many, many versions of this class that will involve different authors and different topics. But I don't think there's a way to avoid Immanuel Kant. He's just that important. It's a massive, massive shift in the way that thought happens after he comes on the scene. So, this gives us maybe some guiding principle, some kind of a little bit of a map to understand what it is that Kant thinks that he's up to or what it is that he's trying to accomplish. And if you know that, then maybe it'll give you some sort of like conceptual furniture, some sort of like little bit of a filing system. As you're reading him, you can kind of say like, that's part of this thing that Adam was talking about. He's trying to offer a genuine response to David Hume. He's trying to talk about how metaphysics could be possible. He's trying to talk about a way to ground the natural sciences. He's trying to talk about a way that pure mathematics can be done such that it's not just analytic symbol manipulation. But we can do more, and I'm going to do more today. I'm going to try to describe Kant's project in at least 2 ways. If there's time, I might get to 3. If the past is any indication of what the future is going to be like, I won't have time, so we'll just have the 2. And this brings up yet another, just kind of like a general tip for reading Kant. And it's this. Kant has a habit of saying the same thing many different ways. And in fact, he'll come right out and say it oftentimes. He'll say, like, here's this one idea, and then he'll say, here's the same idea, but from a slightly different perspective. Or, like, I'm going to kind of unpack the first idea a little bit. It's really the same idea, it's just expressed a slightly different way. If you're familiar at all with Kant's ethics, and we're going to read from his ethics, we're going to read from the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals in the second half of the class, you'll know that Kant talks about the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative. There's only one categorical imperative. It's one idea, but it has many formulations. The first of which is, anybody have this one in their pocket? Act only in such a way that you treat others as an end in themselves and never as a mere means. Which is like, don't use people as a means for your own ends. Treat people like people, might be. Like, that's the very uncontroversial version of the first formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. Treat others as an end in themselves, never as a mere means. Second formulation of the categorical imperative. Wait. That's the second formulation. I got it backwards. Second formulation is treat others as an end in themselves, never as a mere means. The first formulation is act always in such a way such that the maxim of your action could be willed as universal law, which is maybe a fancy way, and this is a little bit of a violence to the idea, but it's kind of a fancy way of saying, what if everybody did that? If everybody did that, would it lead to some kind of conceptual incoherence? And if it does, then that can't possibly be consistent with the universal moral law, and you can't ever do it. Most famously, Kant says, you can't ever lie because it doesn't pass this test. Those seem like 2 very different ideas, and Kant swears up and down that it's the same idea, just expressed in slightly different ways. And we're going to get a collection of, ways of understanding what Kant is up to in this project, the project of the Prolegomena and the Critique of Pure Reason. And they're going to seem like maybe they're very different descriptions of very different projects. But again, like here's the big hint for trying to understand Kant is like when we have these clues of like this and this are supposed to be describing the same thing, when they seem different, the trick to understanding Kant is understanding how these different formulations are in fact just different perspectives on the same idea. All right, so in order to get these slightly different perspectives, these 2, maybe 3 descriptions of what this Kantian project looks like, we got to start back with Hume, because he's offering a genuine response to Hume. And let's start, we've seen this before, let's start with Hume's fork. This is kind of the key mechanism underlying Hume's nasty skeptical arguments in section 4 of the Inquiry. And do we remember what are the two forking paths in Hume's fork? This is about knowledge, yeah.
Relations and matter of fact.
Yeah, so they're relations between what?
Between ideas.
Yeah, relations between ideas. Hume says all knowledge is like one of these 2 species. It can't be both and it can't be neither. There are relations between ideas, and there are matters of fact. And those were those two questions that Hume asked in section 12, that thing that I read where he says, burn all the metaphysics. He says, does it contain any abstract reasoning containing quantity and number? That's this kind. No, if it doesn't contain that, does it contain any experiential reasoning about matters of fact and existence? Boom, that's over here. And Hume seems to be saying, like, almost all metaphysics is neither one of these two things. It claims to be talking about matters of fact, but it's not based on any sort of experience. It's just something that I try to come up with a priori without having any, because nobody has, well, maybe that's not true. Do you have a direct experience of God? I'll say that. I've not had a direct experience of God. Some people say they have, and I'm like, that sounds really awesome. I haven't had that experience myself. I suppose I can only take your word on it. So if it's not one of these two, then commit it to the flames. And this is like the engine of Hume's skeptical argument, is this firewall between these two things and this insistence that there are only these two kinds. And we talked before about how we can understand the relations between ideas as analytic knowledge, which is to say the concept of the predicate is already contained within the concept of the subject. It's true by definition, is how a lot of people will think about analyticity. It's analytic. And what was the other thing that we said about it? It's not just analytic, it's a priori, yeah. Which is to say, it's knowable prior to experience, a priori. So there's analytic a priori knowledge. Those are the relations between ideas. That's mathematics and probably logic as well. And then there are matters of fact. That's natural science, which Hume insists isn't grounded in anything, because when you attempt to ground it, you just get this circular argument about how I expect the future to be more or less like the past, because in the past, the future was more or less like the past. This is synthetic. It's more interesting than analytic knowledge because it's not just stuff that's true by definition. It's not just unpacking the meanings of words. It's not saying all bachelors are male as if that's some kind of as if I just learned something there when somebody said all bachelors are male. If I knew what a bachelor was, I already knew that they were male. But synthetic knowledge brings a subject and a predicate together that don't necessarily contain one another. And therefore, there's new knowledge, right? I can find stuff out when I'm talking about synthetic knowledge. And synthetic knowledge, because it's not true by definition, the only way I can find out whether the cat is on the mat or whether it's raining outside or whether or not the hen lays brown eggs or white eggs is I have to have some experiences. I got to go look at the eggs. I got to stick my hand out the window. I've got to have some experience of the world in order to gain this synthetic knowledge. So it's a posteriori. Which is why Hume says if metaphysics doesn't relate to any experience, if it doesn't have experience that it's based upon, then again, commit it to the flames. It can contain only sophistry and illusion if it's not one of these two things. One way of understanding what Kant is up to is to point out that he's saying no to this. I mentioned that this is kind of this first move that Hume makes, and maybe this is the tricky spot where he makes his argument, where he slips his premise into the room, and maybe we weren't paying attention, and then once we buy into this, all the rest of it kind of naturally just unfolds from it. Kant catches him here and says, I don't think that these are the only two options. Most specifically, I think there's one more third option. Or at least there's this question of whether there's this third option, and it's the option of synthetic a priori. So even without stopping and thinking about what these things mean, if I recognize that analyticity and a priori and syntheticity and a posteriority are two pairs of two concepts, I might think to myself, well, I suppose I could rearrange them in lots of different ways, right? I could talk about, instead of analytic a priori knowledge, I could talk about analytic a posteriori knowledge, or I could talk about synthetic a priori knowledge. And Hume seems to indicate that they always come together. Analyticity always comes with a priori, and syntheticity always comes with a posteriority. And now Kant is raising this as a question to say, really? Does it always work that way? And he's going after synthetic a priori, but maybe just to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about here by kind of shuffling up these categories a little bit. Maybe let's wonder, why not the other option? Why not analytic a posteriori? If something is known analytically, what does that mean again? Yeah, Pearson. Yeah, the predicate is already contained within the subject, right? Bachelor means unmarried male, so all bachelors are male, just as all unmarried males are males. Male was already in bachelor. I just unpacked it, right? Another way of saying this is it's true by definition, right? Sometimes we might think of this as kind of boring knowledge, things that are true by definition. An analytic a posteriori statement, or something that was known analytically and a posteriori, would be something that's true by definition, but you have to have experience in order to know it. What the hell is that? Does that even make any sense? Is that like a possibility? If it was a possibility, would it be an interesting possibility? If it's innate, then it shouldn't require experience in order to get it, though, right? Innate idea has got to be a priori. If it's true by definition, why do I need experience for it? And some folks might think to yourself, like, well, you need the experience of learning what words mean, maybe something like that. Maybe there's some kind of linguistic approach to this that would make analytic a posteriority interesting. But on its surface, it seems like this is the worst of both worlds. This is like analytic statements are boring. They're not interesting because they don't tell you anything new. And a posteriori knowledge is kind of like, it's kind of crappy because you got to go have experiences in order to have it. You can't just sit in a cabin and think your way to this knowledge. So it's difficult to obtain and it's trivial. And it's like, why? Like, why would anybody want that? Yeah, Ryan?
What about like laws of physics?
Laws of physics seem to be a posteriori, unless you think you can come up with laws of physics without ever exploring the world.
Well, once they become a law, you have a formula for it. Wouldn't it then be analytic?
So yeah, perhaps we might have like definitions of terms, like force equals mass times acceleration, right? Something like that. Be like, Newton discovered that force equals mass times acceleration. Newton defined force as mass times acceleration, right? He coined a term and like defined what its meaning was. I don't know if like I'm not sure if anybody was like walking around saying like, force, what is it? Like it was not like a concept where like we have to discover what the nature of force is. Turns out it's mass times acceleration. Sir Isaac Newton was sitting underneath a tree, an apple came and like fell and bonked on him the head, and like he was like, I've discovered it. Like that's not how F equals ma works. It's just a definition of terms, right? So if we're thinking of certain sorts of scientific laws like that, maybe they're just definitions of our terms. If they're descriptions of matters of fact, things whose contradictions wouldn't be self-contradictory, right? If I said like not to it. If I said force is something other than mass times acceleration, would I be contradicting myself? Perhaps I would. That would put it over here. If I said something like the acceleration due to the force of gravity on the surface of the Earth is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. What if it was different? Would that be incoherent? Would I be contradicting myself? Is it possible that the acceleration due to gravity at the Earth's surface is a little bit different? Is there a possible world where this makes sense? And it's like, yeah, I guess. Why not? This could have been different. And in fact, I have to go and do experiments in the world on the surface of the Earth in order to determine that. So those are matters of fact. And Kant, he doesn't like walk us through like, what about analytic a posteriori? But like we can get that maybe like that one's not going to be interesting. It's the worst of both worlds. If metaphysics is going to be possible and interesting, if it's going to be about the world, and you don't need experience of the world in order to come to it. Yeah, right? I don't know. We're going to want synthetic a priori. Yeah, that was actually a difficult conceptual leap that I got interrupted by the siren on. So if I want something that's going to make metaphysics possible, perhaps what I want is something that's genuinely new knowledge and it's about the world. It's not just true by definition, and I can know it without having any experience of the world. I can do it. I can access it through rational thought alone. So we'd have synthetic a priori. But now there's this question of like, so what does that mean? Or is it possible? And Kant is like, yeah, I know. That's the question. Is this possible? And if metaphysics is going to be possible, Kant says the route to it is going to be through this synthetic a priori. So there we go. There's like kind of key number one. If like this is what Kant's plan is. Like how could metaphysics be possible? He's offering a genuine response to Hume. Here we have a response to Hume. Hume says, boom, this or this. And Kant says, but what about this? Because if this was the case, then metaphysics would be possible. So here we go. That's like one way of thinking what's going on in the Prolegomena. It's the story of synthetic a priori. There were some hands up just a second ago. Yeah, Pearson. There's a square, it has four sides. What is the definition of square?
Right, so I just found it like analytic.
Yeah, it seems like maybe that's over here. Although Kant is going to give us a different take on mathematics, too, that actually Kant is, I think, is going to say maybe square has four sides isn't over. He's going to say it's over here, actually.
Can you tell us something about the world where there wouldn't be a square without four sides?
Wait, say that again?
Wouldn't that tell us something about the world that you would never find a square without four sides?
Perhaps it just tells me what the meaning of the noise square is. Like, what is the concept that attaches to, like, square?
Probably it's like trying to have a boundary that the world can't be.
Oh, yeah, maybe.
What it is.
Or just that the world can't be such that, like, we have conceptual contradictions, right? Or we can't talk about the world in ways that involve conceptual contradictions, right?
These are going for like not just big things, this is going for like this.
Like the cat is on the mat, like any kind of knowledge that I could come up with, right? Well, I guess it depends. If it's how could metaphysics be possible, it's answers to metaphysical questions. Are there, like, can we come up with answers to metaphysical questions? And Kant is going to say, like, some of them we can. Others are kind of like beyond the reaches of pure reason alone. This is why it's a critique of pure reason. How is natural science possible, and is it groundable? Kant's going to say yes, and it's going to be grounded by like a certain sort of a metaphysical concept that has to do with synthetic a priori, and then this question about pure mathematics is going to get roped into it as well. Yeah.
So like he's trying to like get to like there are squares, not just like if they do exist, like there actually does exist a square.
Is it okay if I just don't answer that question? And not like never, just not today. Because our next meeting is going to be the pure mathematics meeting, and it's probably going to pop up then. So like once we get a sense of like what Kant is saying about mathematics and how mathematics is possible, it might answer your question. Okay. Yes?
Really fast, if I was going to write down a definition for synthetic a priori, what would I write?
You would write, the synthetic part means there's kind of like novel combinations of subject and predicate. I'm like making new unions between subject and predicate when I come to this knowledge. So something like water is wet, maybe. If wet isn't in the definition of water, then learning that water is wet would be a synthetic statement. It would join together a subject with some predicate that isn't already contained within it. The a priori part is prior to, that's the priori, right? It's prior to experience. So Hume was telling us that the only things that I can know prior to experience are analytic truths, things that are true by definition. And the only way that I can come up with synthetic knowledge is through experience. So it would all have to be a posteriori. So that's what Hume's fork is all about, and Kant is saying, like, not so fast. I think we got this other third option, and it's really important. How are we doing so far on this? Yes, Corinne. Analytic a posteriori? I'm not sure that it's a thing. And even if it were a thing, it seems like it wouldn't be particularly interesting. So analytic would mean, instead of novel combinations of subject and predicate, analytic statements are ones where the subject is already in the predicate. Or sorry, the predicate is already in the subject. So things that are true by definition are analytic statements. So it would be truths that are true by definition that you can only know through experience. That's what an analytic a posteriori truth would be. And I think in order to kind of like get like all of the possible combinations of these terms, we might have to like get at least why that might seem silly and why it's unsurprising that nobody is on a hunt for like, well, let's find all the analytic a posteriori things. It's like all of the things that are trivially true, but like you have to have experience in order to know. Yeah, kind of like hard to acquire useless knowledge. That's not entirely true because like mathematics and logic aren't exactly useless, right?
Can be used to derive other analytic
That's right. That's how logic and mathematics frequently works.
Right, but if it's analytic a posteriori, then all of its implications would also be a posteriori.
Yeah, I suppose it would be...
You'd be able to observe them without actually knowing
Yeah.
fact.
Perhaps as an example, and this maybe gets to Pearson's question about the squares too. Analytic a posterior knowledge would be something like trying to prove that all squares have four sides by a demonstration of an exploration of like as many squares as possible. So it would be like an inductive approach to like all squares have four sides. It would be like check the square, like four sides, four sides, four sides, four sides. All the squares have four sides. Well, all the ones I've seen so far, so I can't be sure. We might be like, well, dude, it's just true by definition. Why take this long route to it? If it didn't have four sides, it wouldn't be a square. Exactly, yeah. All right. So that's the weird, like, analytic a posteriori business, which, like, I know I've been talking about for a little while, and, like, it seems like you guys are interested in it, but now I'm going to say, like, forget about it because it's dumb and nobody cares about it. That's the one that's interesting. That's the one that Kant is concerned with. If you're interested in understanding Kant, which you should be by virtue of the fact that you're in this class, you should care what synthetic a priori are all about. And the rest of his project is out to try to explain this. So I'm actually going to try to give a little bit of sketch of what that looks like, and that's going to lead us into our next sorts of ways of understanding the Kantian project. And let's start here. In fact, I think we saw something kind of like this at our last meeting. I started drawing pictures. You know, professors frequently draw on the board in class? Do you enjoy it when they try to draw? Just watching us try to do things we're not good at? All right, little Bob Ross moment here. Happy little tree. You seen worse trees? Good. Well, I mean, not good for the trees, I suppose, but... Not to draw on the board? Well, look at me, just flaunting convention. All right, so there's the tree. And there's your charming little head. Yeah, it is better than last time, right? Yeah. Yeah, I did. That's all I did this morning. So there's your head, which I know you might be thinking of like, that head is huge. You're like, maybe the tree is small, or maybe there's like parallax, or something like that. Get off my back. It's just a drawing. Maybe this is why you don't do it. So we explored, I think at our last meeting, that there are some like weird little puzzles in how this is supposed to work. That Hume gave us some sort of like picture of how this works, where he said like, okay, in order to like see the tree, in order to have a sense impression of the tree, in order to have an idea of the tree, I need to have an impression of the tree, and then my idea is a copy of that impression. And in order to have the impression, I suppose I need some sort of like sensory apparatus. I need an eyeball. Like 2 will give me depth perception, but I only need 1 to see the tree. And then how, like, you guys help me out. Like, how does the rest of this work? You're relatively educated. How do I see a tree?
With your eyes.
With my eyes? All right, so we've got the eye. Fill in the gaps for me. There's light. There's photons. Good. All right, yeah, fancy words. So, yeah. So photons, where do they come from?
The tree.
Do they got the tree? It's a glowing tree that's just like kicking off photons constantly? The sun. From the sun, yeah, because we're all good Platonists, and we know it all starts with the sun, the form of the good. So, yeah, there's the sun, and it's generating photons, and let's not get into like how that happens. It's a little bit complicated. But yeah, whether you think about these as rays or waves or like a particle sort of a theory, the light comes from the sun, it hits the tree, it bounces off the tree. In certain frequencies are going to get like bounced off in like different angles, and some of them are going to get absorbed, and other ones are going to get reflected. But like long story short, that light goes from the sun to the tree, and then from the tree to my eyeball. And there's a lens in the eyeball and some other optics stuff, and ends up with like an inverted image of a tiny little happy tree upside down on my retina. Yeah. And is there sight yet? When the image is on the back of my eyeball, is that sight? No. So at our last meeting, we said the little man in your head has to see the image first. And then we're like, that's not going to work. Because, like, the little man has to see, and then, like, how does the little man see, right? This is known as a homuncular theory of how the mind works. Homunculus literally means a little person, like in your mind brain, who just lives there and watches the movie. And it's like, that's not going to work, because then we're going to have to how their mind works, how they watch the movie, and they must have a little man in their head, and just and so on and so on and so on. That's going to be a problem. But it's something like this, and we know that there's going to be maybe some kind of like electrical impulses, and like shit goes on in my brain, and maybe after sufficient things have happened in my brain, now I see the tree. Okay. David Hume told us that I only ever have access to what's going on in here. And through habit and custom, I make certain sorts of connections between all of the impressions that I get and the ideas that I have that are copies of impressions. And I try to make some sort of inferential leap to, like, statements or claims about what the world is like out here. But that's not actually grounded. Like, I can't, like, make any references to substance like that with any sort of, like, rational warrant. And so one of the things that Hume is telling us is that you can't have this side. You're going to only be able to talk about what's going on in here. And Kant totally buys into this. He says, yes, David Hume, you are right. That's why you awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. There is a hard wall between the stuff that's going on out here and the stuff that's going on in here. And it's not just my eyeball is not the only way that I come to learn about the world. I also have kind of long, creepy fingers that can touch the tree. Yeah. And so we get a similar sort of story, right? Where I like touchy, and then kind of like similar sort of story, right? Okay. No, it's a tree. It's still a tree. And maybe broccoli it's not a tree. But it's a little tree. It's a bonsai. All right. So, Kant refers to this side of this, like the things in themselves is the phrase that he uses. The things in themselves. Kant refers to this as noumena. It comes from the Greek nous, which, like, that's a pesky little term. I'm never really sure what anybody means when they're talking about nous. But nous is this, like, loosely, it's this faculty of the mind that allows you to just kind of like grasp things instantly. It's a way of knowing. And when we talk about the noumena, it's usually in kind of like a variation on this where we're talking about it's the objects of knowledge. So this is why this is referred to as the noumena. I have knowledge, but what's that knowledge of? If we think it's about the world, then that's noumena. These are the things in themselves. And then on this side, I have what's known as, not noumena, but phenomena. And phenomena is all the stuff that's happening in my mind. Phenomena is all the stuff that's happening not out there in the world, not the things in themselves. It's everything that's happening on this side of the divide. And Kant totally agrees with Hume and says, like, look, we got to grow up. Like, post-Humean metaphysics has got to recognize that this stuff over here, it's just off limits. I can't know anything about it. That's not to say that Kant is denying that noumena exist or that there are no things in themselves. He's just going to say, anytime you try to talk about the things in themselves, short of what I'm saying right now about the things in themselves, anytime you try to make some sort of truthful claim about the things in themselves, you're reaching beyond your grasp. You're like falling prey to this thing that Hume is criticizing. So we can only talk about phenomena. So far this kind of looks like, this looks basically like Hume. How is this something new? How are we going to get to synthetic a priori? Well, Kant says, in order to like figure this out, we're going to have to really get into like what's going on in here. So let's blow this up and recognize that it's a complex process of what's happening. It's a complex process that starts with something that's kind of roughly like Humean impressions, something that is going to be a term that's going to plague us all through like all 4 meetings that we're going to spend talking about Kant's metaphysics, called intuitions. And you'll be introduced to intuitions in the first reading assignment that you get. There are intuitions, and these are things that are kind of like Humean sense impressions. This This is the raw sense data. It's the feed from the fire hose immediately as sensation is happening. Or perhaps as reflection is happening, if you want to follow like this kind of Lockean model. You can have intuitions that start with kind of like recognizing what's happening in my mind right now. It's the raw feed. And kind of like we've suggested before, this is kind of like this part of the Lockean tabula rasa sort of approach to the mind that perhaps assumes that we start with nothing, is that these intuitions all on their own are unintelligible. This is kind of like imagine what a newborn baby sees and hears and smells and experiences, which is to say, I don't know if a newborn baby has any experiences. I think maybe it's what William James referred to as the blooming, buzzing confusion of the world. It's just chaotic yelling and colors, and it's just like, ah! That's like all that you've got in intuition. It hasn't been made sense of yet. It hasn't been organized, and that's the next step in this process for Kant. These intuitions get organized, and they get organized by concepts. So, and I think we've done this exact little experiment before, but what's this? It's a tablet. It's not. It's a tablet case. Tablet's over there. So it's a red tablet case, but just tell me about the sense impressions. Just tell me like what's the raw sense data that you have? Because there you go. It's beautiful. Well, I don't know how to handle that one exactly without getting into some other stuff. But short of being beautiful, and I'm not sure that we can do this through intuition alone, it's flat. It's red. It's rectangular. Yeah, it's quadrilateral. It's smaller than a bread box, all of these things, right? Can I know that it's flat without having a concept of flat? Nope. Can I know that it's red without having a concept of red? I need to already have the concept of red in order to recognize this as red. So before I have any concept of red, this is not red. This is not intelligible at all. It's not a rectangle. It's not flat. It sure as hell ain't a tablet case. It's a tablet case is something I get to like way down the road, right? So it starts off with intuitions, and these get organized by concepts. And only after intuitions get organized by concepts is experience possible. Only then can I have an experience, because experience has to be the sort of thing that can be meaningful for you, as far as Kant is concerned. And maybe he's playing a little bit idiosyncratic by what he means by experience, but I don't think this is just a little definitional sleight of hand here. I think he's got a really strong point to make here, which is to say that like you have no experience until you've at least begun to make sense of the sense data that's coming in. This is kind of the same reason why that little inverted image on the back of my eyeball, that's not seeing yet. And even like when it gets into my brain, like that's not seeing yet. Like something needs to happen to that before I can see. I need to like see it as something. It needs to be organized according to concepts before I can actually have an experience. Yeah, Pearson.
You're staring off into space, or you're like lost in thought, and listening to music you got like in your earphones. Like that would not be experience.
No, that would be experience, probably. If you're lost in thought, you're thinking thoughts, right?
You're not thinking, but then you're seeing.
Oh, yeah. So, right, yeah. If I'm lost in thought or I'm listening to music, and perhaps this happens, I don't know, do you guys believe that this is a thing that can happen? Your eyes could be open, sense data could be coming into your eyeballs, and it's not because you're blind or anything like that. It's because your mind is otherwise occupied. It's attending to something else. And so, like, the sense data is coming into your system, but because you're not attending to it, you're not seeing anything. That's right.
I read something like it was like when you move your eyeballs, like your brain takes like this guard that information, like when you're like move your eyesight, because your brain would like overload with information.
Yeah. If it kind of like registered every single like small movement of the eyes. Yeah, because you move your eyes constantly, and it's short, jerky motions too. Like you'd get seasick, I think, if you kind of experienced all the little movements of your eyes. So yeah, that might be part of it. Yeah, there are all the sorts of things that get ignored. If they don't get, maybe more to the point for Kant, if it doesn't get organized by concepts, it can't possibly be experienced yet. Sarah?
I was going to say, isn't that kind of like, when you're driving and you don't feel like you're driving and you just end up at the place you want and you aren't focused the whole time?
Maybe, yeah. But I would also suggest that like you guys are going for interesting examples, but like maybe not the sorts of examples that are going to help kind of crack the Kantian coconut for you. Which is to think about the intuitions as something that are like always, you don't have to be distracted while you're driving, you don't have to be listening to music, you don't have to be lost in thought. When I'm seeing things right now, you guys all see me, you all see Rosenfeld, or you all see like a shortish, kind of pudgy, bearded guy, and you hear him talking. Like these are like all things that you're seeing, like these intuitions are in play here. It's referring to like everything that happens before you start to organize your experience according to concepts. That's maybe not even quite right. It's not that you're organizing your experience, you're organizing the intuitions, you're organizing the sense data so that you can have an experience. So every experience starts with intuition that gets organized by concepts in order to become experience. Yes?
Your senses perceive, or your senses sense, I would say that.
Yeah, of course.
Intuitions. They don't sense the experience, they sense the intuition. Then your mind starts to supply the mind.
Let's try to tolerate a certain amount of not understanding what an intuition is just yet. Because we're going to get 3 more meetings, and the very next one that we have is all about this stage. It's all about intuitions. The next one after that is all about this. The next one after that goes into like La La Land. That's when we're talking about metaphysics. But yeah, let's save that for our next meeting, trying to figure out exactly what an intuition is. But for now, like placeholder, my first Fisher-Price, like what's an intuition concept? It's kind of what Hume was talking about with sense impressions. Not yet ideas. And not yet experience. And this is actually a really clever move that Kant has made, and I think it's more than just a clever move. But notice that if experience is all the way over here, everything that has to be before experience is, what's the word for things that are before experience? Oh, yeah, whoa, there was you get a little like tingly sensation on the back of your neck. These are all a priori. Because they're before experience. And Kant is like also a little bit, you've got to loosen up what before means or what prior means in order to understand Kant too, because he's not necessarily talking about temporal priority. I'm kind of giving a description of this as a mechanism. And as a mechanism that we're all looking at from the outside, right? From some omniscient third-person perspective. Like, what's going on in, like, Duder's head right here? But we don't have such a view. If we did, we'd be talking about, it would be somebody's mind over here in the noumena, right? We'd be talking about the things in themselves. We only have a first-person view. And oftentimes the sort of priority that Kant is talking about is not necessarily temporal priority. It's maybe the sort of priority that says this is necessary in order for this. So that makes the first thing, the thing that's necessary for the second thing is prior to the second thing, because you can't have the second thing without the first thing. And that doesn't necessarily mean order in time. It's a different kind of priority. This is going to become like a real problem when we start recognizing that like time is this thing that we have to figure out. Like, how does time work? And Kant is going to be all over. He's like, I'll tell you how time works. Synthetic a priori. So it's maybe a different sort of priority, and maybe he's like playing a little bit fast and loose there, or maybe you have to loosen up your mind in order to kind of follow him. But notice, like once we have experience downstream over here, everything upstream of it is going to be a priori. It's going to be prior to experience. And so if there's anything that we can find that's going on in here that's true and not by definition, it's going to be synthetic a priori. And this is one way of trying to like get a first pass idea of what synthetic a priori means. Synthetic a priori or like how it is that Kant arrives at synthetic a priori is he's looking for the necessary conditions for experience. Whatever the necessary conditions for experience are going to be, they're going to be a priori. And if they're things that are true of how minds work that aren't true by definition. So if I was thinking of like what's an analytic statement about mind or about the thinking self, right? What's the analytic statement about thinking things? They think? Yeah, that's kind of like Descartes, all like back in meditation too. Like this is maybe what's true of a thinking thing by definition. It thinks. Kant is going to say some things that aren't necessarily true by definition, so they're synthetic. And they're the necessary conditions for experience, so they're a priori. And now we're off to the races. This, by the way, this kind of like picture that I'm portraying here that's talking about the necessary conditions for experience and also says we're going to analyze what's happening here in the structure of consciousness itself, or in the structure of like experience, or the structure of the understanding, or the structure of thought, is a massive inversion of like what metaphysics looks like, or like what reality looks like. Kant refers to this as a Copernican, we've heard this before, this phrase before, a Copernican revolution. Kant says, this is a Copernican revolution. He even uses that phrase in the introduction of the Prolegomena. And so like when you see it, you'll be like, that's that thing that Rosenfeld was talking about. He's not talking about, well, what was the original Copernican, what was Copernicus's Copernican revolution? We talked about this when we were talking about Descartes and setting the stage, talking about Galileo. Yeah, it's this like heliocentric versus geocentric thing, right? Does the sun go around the earth, or does the earth go around the sun? And hopefully I expressed to you guys what just a mind-blowing shift of perspective this was for anybody who was a proponent of the geocentric view. If you were walking around the world thinking like, obviously the sun goes around the earth, and it's easy to see how somebody would think that. If that was how you understood the universe, the day that somebody tells you, like, no, it's the other way around, we're not standing still, we're moving around other things, this is the sort of thing that, like, maybe you would not be able to follow that leap. If we believe folks like Thomas Kuhn about this, about, like, how scientific revolutions happen historically, he notes that, like, most people don't actually change their minds. Like, our minds are not that flexible. Like, we can't make huge, momentous, like, radical shifts in the way that we understand the world for the most part. Most of the time, the way that a scientific revolution like this happens is that, like, the old people who believe the old theory, they just die eventually. And the new people who believe the new theory, they take over because they're younger and sprier and not yet dead. So Kant's not talking about this literal Copernican revolution. The Copernican revolution that he's talking about is one that, like, maybe is not so easy to take for granted. When I say, like, the sun goes around the earth instead of the earth going around the sun, or no, the other way around. The earth goes around the sun instead of the sun going around the earth. You're like, yeah, obviously, I understand that. And maybe you can even try to put yourself in somebody's shoes who didn't understand that and, like, try to understand how difficult that is for them. But this one is maybe one that, like, is so new to you that it's going to be difficult for you to make the jump. And it's this. It's reality is not out here. Objectivity is not out here. The knowledge that we have of the world is not about things that are out here. Because this is off limits. That's noumena. Hume said, like, you can't have it. And Kant is like, yeah, you're totally right, Hume. This is off limits. All I know is that there are things in themselves, maybe, and that's like where my conversation about that starts and stops. But maybe we can talk about reality. Maybe we can talk about knowledge that is objective. And it's about what's going on here. And not just in this person's mind, but in anybody's mind. If it's true for every single possible thinking subject, then maybe, like, I don't know, maybe that's all that objectively true needs to mean. It doesn't need to be like that's how the world is out here in the noumenal things in themselves. It just has to be, this is the structure of consciousness for anything that thinks. So what Kant is up to here, this Copernican revolution business, it's about like the reversal of like where we think reality is. Is it out here in the world, or is it, that's maybe not even the right way to say it, because Kant would, I think, be relatively happy to say, like, there's a world. Like, you have an idea of the world, and it's in here, where ideas live, in minds. Reality is here. Objectivity is here. Knowledge about things. The knowledge is in here, and the things that the knowledge is about is also in here. It's all in here. It's all in minds. And this is the big Copernican shift. What's that? It's not in your mind. It's in everybody's minds. And that's not to say there isn't like a material world out there. Like Berkeley says, like, therefore there's no material world. Kant is like, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. Who knows? And who cares? Like, why are we, like Hume's right, stop wasting your time trying to figure this stuff out. and just recognize we can still do metaphysics, we can still do natural science, and it's all about how this thing works. It's all about the structures and necessary conditions that are going on up here. And then, again, Hume had an inquiry concerning human understanding. Kant is not limiting himself to just human understanding. This is not just about the human mind and how it works. Kant says this is how any possible mind works. Anything that thinks is going to have to think in these ways in order for these to be necessary conditions for experience. Like, we're thinking about like all the ways in which your experiences are different than mine. Those differences are obviously not necessary conditions for experience, right? Because you didn't have them while I did, right? Or I didn't have them while you did. Necessary conditions for experience are going to be the same, things that are the same for all possible minds. So aliens, if they were to visit us from like some other galaxy, their minds would work that way as well, so long as they could think. And Kant says if God thinks, and he's not sure if God does think, but if God thinks, then God's mind is going to have to work this way as well. And that's time, right? This is a bit of an overview. So we got the two. The two big keys here are like, well, first, nobody's trying to accomplish and know that his solution seems to be the synthetic a priori thing. And we can think about synthetic a priori as like, it's about these necessary structures of consciousness. And in part, what that's going to require is a complete reversal of what we think we're doing when we like come up with objective truths, when we talk about reality, when we do metaphysics. It's this Copernican revolution. It's the third one, but like I said, we have 4 sessions on Kant, so plenty of time for all of the different versions of what it is that he's up to. If you have any questions, feel free to stick around. If you don't have something to do immediately after this, like I said, there's that talk at 5 o'clock over in MHRA, and I'll see you guys next week.